Hello and good evening from Singapore. I'm Elberini from the Singapore Global Network, SGN for short. Now, as part of the 1-hour program today, Ambassador Lawrence Bay, Singapore's ambassador to Germany, will be providing his welcome remarks shortly. Following that, our speakers today, Dr. Ooi Eng Eong and Ms. Evangeline Tan, will share on the topics today, followed by the Q&A session. I would like to now pass the time to Ambassador Bay to address us. Ambassador, please.
Thank you, Elberini, for the kind introduction. And hi, everyone. Good afternoon. And if I may, Guten Tag aus Berlin. Pleasure to spend the next hour or so with all of you on this cold Tuesday wintry afternoon. Let me first and foremost thank Professor Ooi and Evangeline, our two distinguished speakers, for joining us in today's webinar. I think it's great that many of you, our Singaporeans residing here in Europe, you have taken time this afternoon to log on and to watch this webinar either by yourself or with your family members. I'm sure we are all looking forward to hearing from Prof. Ooi and Evangeline in a few minutes. Now, as many of you know, the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or MFA, we have several offices throughout Europe. So besides our embassy here in Berlin, MFA also operates a network of embassies in Brussels, Paris, our High Commission in London, our permanent representation in Geneva. We have offices in Vienna as well as The Hague in the Netherlands. And further afield, we have two embassies in Moscow, Russia, and in Ankara, in Turkey. In addition, we are also supported by our Singapore-based non-resident ambassadors to several European countries. And we also have honorary consulates located in several major cities in Finland, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Portugal, to name a few. So we are very much well placed to keep in touch with Singaporeans all over Europe and to assist wherever necessary. So during the past 12 months, my MFA colleagues and I have done our level best to support our fellow Singaporeans in a number of ways. For example, we have been giving you timely updates and advice on the COVID-19 travel or border restrictions and the lockdowns. And notwithstanding the lockdown that is now happening mostly throughout Europe, we have provided prompt consular assistance as well as notarial services. And you can be assured that we will continue to do so. But there are unfortunately some things we are unable to do, right? And one of them is vaccination. The other is mental health. There's much that can be said, particularly about vaccination. It's front page news almost daily. And many of you are asking, are vaccines safe? Are they really effective, especially with the emergence of new variants? And we have also received many questions from Singaporeans for this webinar, like, can we get vaccinated at the embassy? How do I sign up to be vaccinated in Singapore, etc.? And I'll be happy to address some of these queries later towards the end of today's session. Less mentioned in the media, unfortunately, but of no less importance, I believe, is how many people are struggling with all sorts of emotional and mental issues for a variety of reasons, which is why my MFA colleagues and I thought it was timely and appropriate for us to organize today's webinar. And I'm so glad we can do this together with Elberini and her colleagues from SGN, so that we can address some of these pressing concerns and questions. Because the well-being of our overseas Singaporeans is at the front and center of what we in MFA, our colleagues in SGN, civil servants of the Singapore government, this is what we do each day and every week. So speaking on behalf of my MFA colleagues that are who are based here in this part of the world, I hope everyone who is tuning in will take the opportunity this afternoon to tap the expertise of our fellow Singaporeans, Prof. Ooi and Evangeline. And with that, let me hand the time back to Elberini for the main segment of today's webinar. Thank you, and over to you, Elberini.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, much has been said and written about the safety and effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccine. However, there are still many people who are hesitant about taking the vaccine, mostly because they are unsure if it's unsafe, or it's truly safe rather. There are many questions and concerns on how it works. Are there any side effects after taking it? And if one can still get infected after being vaccinated? And here to share more and address some of them, we are honored to have Professor Ooi Eng Eong from the Duke-NUS Medical School. Professor Ooi holds a concurrent appointment at the SingHealth Duke-NUS Global Health Institute, as well as joint professorships at the Saw Swee Hock School of Public Health and the Department of Microbiology and Immunology, Yong Su Lin School of Medicine, both at the National University of Singapore. He co-directs the Viral Research and Experimental Medicine Center at the SingHealth Duke-NUS Academic Medical Center. Now, many of Professor Oi's awards to acknowledge his illustrious career and achievements included the Clinician Scientist Senior Investigator Award by the National Medical Research Council of Singapore in 2010, 2014, and 2019. And just last week, Professor Ooi and the frontline workers were collectively named as the Singapore of the Year 2019 by the Straits Times. May I now invite Professor Ooi to speak. Professor, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alberini, for the very kind introduction. I want to extend my thanks to Ambassador Bay for the opportunity to join you in this webinar this evening here in Singapore. So what I thought I'll do to begin with is just to share with you some fundamental information on COVID-19 vaccines. And hopefully, as I do that, then I'll answer some of the more pressing questions, or at least the questions I commonly get. And then we'll go on to the other questions that you might have, and hopefully we'll be able to settle the concerns that would hold you back in terms of vaccination. So let me first of all start off with this, that I'm sure all of you know, we have well over 100 million cases of COVID-19 now all over the world, and well over 2 million deaths, fast approaching 2.4 million. So this is and all this happened over 1 year. And so this is a global health crisis that we are witnessing unfolding right before our eyes. Because of the gravity of the situation, obviously amongst all the measures that have been put in place, then vaccine development is one of those that were amongst the pipeline of measures that we hope to be able to use to control COVID-19. This is a tracker that New York Times have set up, and you can find this online. So as of yesterday, when I did this slide, this is the situation. So 4 vaccines have been approved in various parts of the world. I'll describe some of them later. 6 others have received limited authorization in some countries, and then many others in various phases of clinical trials. So we have about 100 vaccines in the pipeline. So what are the vaccines, and how do they work? What are the different kinds of vaccine? So right in the middle is a virus, and the virus is a very simple organism. And I apologize for those of you who are scientists in this audience. This is going to be very simple for you, but I hopefully I won't bore you. But the goal here is to basically I'll try and describe scientific terms in as layman approach as I can. So right in the middle is a virus, and the virus is a very simple organism. It consists of a genetic material, either in the form of DNA or RNA, never both, and surrounded by a coat of proteins. Right. So this is a representative of SARS coronavirus. So it has an RNA genome, and it has these proteins on the outside, which are representative of the spike protein. So you think of the spike protein as a key that the virus then uses to unlock the door to our cell. And what it needs to do is to get this piece of genetic material into our cell in order to replicate. So what the virus wants to do is essentially to survive in our cells, right? So it gets into the body, pumps its genetic material into our cells, that then forms the information to then form new viral particles. So therefore, the best vaccine in the world is a mimic of this. So it's a live virus, but it's weakened in some form. And usually this is in the form of a genetic mutation that then weakens the virus. So, and also called live attenuated vaccine. These are the forms of vaccines that gives you the best immunity, usually over years, right? So arguably the best vaccine that we have in the world is the yellow fever vaccine, where one single injection gives you 10 years or more of protection. The other good vaccines are like your measles, mumps, and rubella. They're all live, right? So they simulate infection, but not to the extent that will make you sick. But making live vaccines are difficult because you need to know, most of the time it's a chance discovery, or you need to know where to mutate the virus in order to weaken it. Right. So the more common ways that we have approached vaccine are these over here, and I'll go with in the anti-clockwise order. So inactivated vaccine basically just means that you grow the virus and then you kill it with a chemical treatment, usually in the form of a formalin or other chemical that's quite harsh, and essentially just inactivates the virus. So the virus is essentially dead. So then, therefore, this kind of vaccine does not actually simulate infection. It just shows your immune system like a statue or a bust, right? So you recognize that, okay, this is the virus, but you don't know what it does, right? Whereas this one, you kind of see everything play out in front of you. So split and inactivated is just a variant of this. So it's further chemical treatment to really break the virus up. And then you have the newer forms of vaccines over here. So, ranging from peptides all the way to recombinant viral vector. But I'm not going to describe every one, but just the key ones. So right here is your Sinovac, the China vaccine, and Bharat Biotech, the one made in India. These are the adenovirus-based vaccine. So adenovirus is a common virus that infects man. Or in the case of what Oxford has done is to use a chimpanzee adenovirus. And the idea of using a chimpanzee adenovirus is that it doesn't infect man. So therefore it must be safe, right? So you use this virus to carry the genetic material of the SARS coronavirus spike gene into the body. Alternatively, you can, and then the spike protein will then be made inside the body. Alternatively, you can make the spike protein in your manufacturing facility, as what Novavax has done, right? So here you just see the protein, there's no genetic material. Alternatively, instead of getting another virus to carry the genetic material, you deliver it in the form of DNA or RNA. DNA has fallen out of favor somewhat because it's hard to deliver into a body. It's quite painful if you have to use a gene gun, so people don't like it. So what's revolutionized this aspect of vaccine is the RNA vaccine. And of course, you know about the Pfizer BioNTech. BioNTech is a German company, as well as the Moderna vaccine. This is the form of vaccine, RNA, which is what is being developed in Singapore in partnership with a company in San Diego called Arcturus Therapeutics. So why I'm introducing these vaccines, different forms of vaccines to you, is that although they are all, vaccines in a nutshell, they have nuances, and these nuances are going to become very important because what they do slightly different things. So essentially, I told you that the way the spike protein of the virus works is like a key, right? That's how the virus uses to unlock the door to our cell because it needs to get inside. So the vaccines that would produce antibodies that would block the key from slotting into the lock or from turning the lock, essentially both will then prevent the door from being open, will be your inactivated virus vaccine, i.e. the ones developed by Sinovac and Sinopharm in China, as well as Bharat Biotech, as well as the subunit vaccine that is developed by Novavax. So these will produce mainly antibodies. They won't, however, or they won't produce much in the way of these killer T cells. What killer T cells do is this: they detect what goes on inside the cell or inside the house. So it's not stopping the virus from getting in, but it knows when something shouldn't be there, right? So in a way, it's picking up signal that there is an intruder in the house. And what it does is that it'll come and then it'll get rid of that cell. Right? It basically just kills the cell. And the idea of killing the cell is so that you prevent the virus from spreading. And the other cells will happily regenerate. So there's no effect in terms of killing the cell. And the kind of vaccines that would produce both antibody and the killer T cells are your RNA vaccines and your adenoviral vector vaccines, such as those that's being produced by AstraZeneca, J&J, and Sputnik 5, right? So what are inside the vaccines? Essentially, what you see on the top is the full genome of SARS coronavirus 2, right? From left to right, it has many genes. So it's quite a big virus in terms of the length of its genome. right? It's about 2.5 times longer than dengue virus, which I normally work with. So we don't put the whole virus in. The vaccine only consists of the spike gene. So in other words, the key, not the other components of the virus. Therefore, all the vaccines are not infectious and they cannot cause COVID-19 because it's lacking all these other genes that are present on the SARS coronavirus 2 genome. So the common question that people ask is, because RNA is a genetic material, therefore will RNA vaccine change our DNA and somehow, make us more prone to cancer or other diseases? So it's important to note that actually the cell is very well compartmentalized, right? So things are not just everywhere, they are in very specific compartments. And it's probably healthier to think of a cell as a city. So in other words, where you live is not where the factories are. It's not where the waste recycling plant or incinerator and all that are most of the time, right? So they are all very compartmentalized. So the DNA is inside the nucleus. There's this thing called endoplasmic reticulum. It's a very long word, but best to think of it as this is your factory. So this is your library, this is your factory, this is where you want to make things. And then after that, whatever that you make will then be exported out of the cell. So how do you then know what to make in a factory? Well, the instruction comes from the DNA. So it's healthier to think of the nucleus where the DNA is as like a central library. So for those of you who have not been back to Singapore for a while, this is the central library in Singapore. So you think of it as this is where the instruction is stored, right? So, but you cannot bring the book out of the library, a little bit like a reference library. What you can do, however, is to photocopy the instruction. And that's the form, that's RNA. So DNA is where it's stored. RNA is the copy of the DNA, right? And that you can then bring out, and that goes to the factory, and then you can produce whatever you want to produce in that compartment called the endoplasmic reticulum. So none of these actually meet physically, right? So they are actually in separate compartments. So the instructions therefore flow one way from the library back out into the factory. You can, under very special circumstances, turn the RNA back into DNA. However, I add, first of all, that the RNA vaccines do not have these components. Okay, so an example of where you can find these components is HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, right? HIV has two genes, a gene called reverse transcriptase and another called integrase. That converts the photocopy back into the page that then slots into the DNA, back into the book, and it binds it back to the book. So in a way, it is as complex as that, right? So you cannot just take the photocopy and put it back into the book because it will drop out. You need to convert this photocopy back into the original size of whatever book that you photocopied this from, and then disassemble the entire book, slot it in, and then bind the book back. That's exactly what needs to be done. And HIV has those components, but not RNA vaccine. So therefore, the RNA vaccine that we use cannot convert into DNA and be slotted back into your DNA. And then of course, some of you are going to ask me, how can I be so sure? I can be so sure because actually humans have had thousands and thousands of years of encountering RNA. The RNA is in the form of these viral genomes. So many of us, this is the coronavirus. This is like what SARS-CoV-2 would look like. There are also a lot of human coronaviruses. They are called coronavirus because of these spikes that stick out of the virus. And so it looks like a crown when you look at the crown from the top, right? This is the common cold virus. Many of us have it every year, maybe sometimes more than once a year. And for those who live in Singapore, dengue virus, right? This is what's transmitted by mosquitoes. All these viruses and more have RNA as genomes, right? And in terms of their function, they are effectively mRNA, okay? So we've been encountering these RNA for thousands of years. We have also right now sequenced hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of human genome, complete human genome. At no point has anybody found any of these genetic material inserted into our DNA. That's why I can be very confident RNA does not become DNA unless you have all the right components, which are all missing in both the RNA vaccines as well as these viruses over here. Right? So because the big safety question that is somehow going to affect our DNA and change our susceptibility to cancer and all that just doesn't exist. Okay, so but what are the things that we can expect when we receive the vaccine? So this is the data from the Pfizer BioNTech RNA vaccine. It's about the same trends for the Moderna's vaccine. Essentially, the rates may be different, but the kind of the side effects that you will encounter for all the other vaccines are very similar, right? So these are all very common side effects. So fever, so the common ones will be tiredness, headache, muscle pain, sometimes a bit of joint pain. Some people feel a bit of chills and all that. The second dose is often has more side effects than the first dose, right? But essentially, these are mostly tolerable, right? And at the very most, you can just take, paracetamol, either fever medicine just to get rid of the side effects. And it will last for about a day at the most 2, and then you will be back back to your normal self. So I've had the first dose of the Pfizer's vaccine, and all I had was pain in the injection site that lasted about a day. Then it was back to normal. I'm going to get my second dose tomorrow. So if you're curious what happened to me, please just email me. Then, of course, those are the common side effects. There are the less common side effects, which are the severe allergic reaction. So these are essentially, allergic reaction that happens very rapidly. And usually it starts within 15 minutes of you receiving the vaccine. And if you don't get it within 15 minutes, you're not going to get any of these side effects. And what these are like, swollen throat, swollen eyes, lips, and all that, lightheadedness, low blood pressure. So these are actual emergencies, right? If you look at the RNA vaccine, the most common side effect, the most common allergy, that's a history of allergy is associated with a severe allergic reaction, is allergy to sulfur drugs. So some of the antibiotics, like Bactrim and all that. But although these severe allergic reactions are quite, can be quite scary, they are actually highly treatable. And those of you who have allergy will know that you just carry an EpiPen around, and if you do encounter any of the allergens, just take a shot of EpiPen and you're back to normal within minutes. Right? So although of concern, it can be easily managed. But I think the question that many people are more worried about are these more longer term side effects. I put them in inverted commas, not to indicate, to remind me and to tell you that these are not actually side effects of the vaccine. They are actually the effects of the immune response to the virus, right? To the spike protein. And what are these adverse events? So sometimes for some reason, the antibody that some people develop also cross-react with the sheath around the nerve. So it's a little bit like the wire, right? The insulator that covers the copper wire inside. So our nerve has the same kind of insulation, and it's in the form of a lipid, right, or fatty acid. So sometimes the antibody react against these lipids, and so then you get into some neurological problems like facial nerve paralysis or weakness in the limbs, or more everything below, say, the waist or something like that, or transverse myelitis. These are extremely rare events. They can happen, but they are extremely rare events. But in most cases, people will just recover over time, right? But you also will read that there are other people who say, oh, like in Norway, people died after receiving the vaccine, and therefore it kills the elderly and all that. What is less maybe less known is that Ministry of Health of Norway then retracted that, because when they compared the death rate in those who received the vaccine whilst they were very frail and living in nursing homes, when they compared it to the normal death rates and they would normally encounter in that population, there was no difference, right? So when you read in the news and all, always beware of this fallacy that since event Y follows event X, therefore event X must cause event Y. That's not always true, right? So that any vaccine always has risk. So then, the question therefore is that, perhaps, these risks are not worth encountering. Why not we just wait it out? The problem with waiting it out is this, that I think the SARS coronavirus 2 has gone too far and wide. We're not going to be able to eliminate this virus. This virus is here to stay. It's going to become one of the viruses like influenza and other common cold virus that we get, either seasonally, like where you live in Europe, in the winter months, you tend to get these respiratory illness outbreak, or in Singapore, we tend to just get it all year round because of the tropical nature. So it's here to stay. Then the question, therefore, is that we have to consider is, do we get vaccinated and benefit from it? Although there's, all these very small risk of rare events, but at the same time, you balance that against getting COVID. Now, getting COVID, you might say that, many of us, we are young, so we're okay, let's take a chance. That's true, you may not die from COVID, but what we're beginning to learn is that actually the illness is quite long. It can last, 75% of those diagnosed with COVID continue to have symptoms 6 months after they recover from the acute illness, right? And these symptoms very often are quite debilitating. They are like tiredness, inability to concentrate. You cannot exercise as you normally would because you get breathless and all that. So these are very long, debilitating symptoms, and we don't know right now how long these symptoms would last. So that's what we're trying to, the trade-off of vaccination along with the associated small risk of adverse events is in balance to, if you are not vaccinated and if you do get COVID, then this is what can be expected. So finally, the question of safety is always because the vaccine was developed so quickly, so corners were cut. So therefore, this is not safe. It's not true. Okay, so this is the normal process of vaccine development. You go from left to right, starting with you identify what target you want to do, what target you want to go after, and then how you produce it. Then you do the lab studies, then you do the clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, then you file for registration, etc., and then you get it licensed. So usually this whole process takes more than 10 years. So how do we crunch this back down to 11 months? So the reason how we managed to shrink the timeline is actually to run all these things in parallel. You don't wait for one another. The reason why normally companies do one at a time is because whilst doing this part of the development, they don't commit money to this part of the study, right? So essentially, dragging this out is to de-risk their financial commitment until they're sure that everything looks good, then they start this. Everything looks good, then they start this. Everything looks good, then they start this. So that's why it takes so long. But because of the pandemic and the emergency that we all face, then a lot of developers now take on the financial risk and commit to the study before knowing the results of the earlier phases, right? So in other words, they commit to conducting clinical trials as and they are doing the production and the preclinical studies. That's how we did it in Singapore, or that's how we are doing it in Singapore as well. So that's how you crunch the timeline. It's just, instead of dragging it out, you do as much as you can simultaneously. So this is my last slide. I just want to end with this, that, I think in a way, the COVID-19 isn't going to be new. This is, I think, what we are going to face. And if you look at just the last 20 years, this is just, from year 2000 onwards, we have already had 7 major outbreaks, starting with SARS, then the swine origin H1N1, MERS, although limited to mostly Middle East and Korea, Ebola in West Africa, Zika in Latin America, yellow fever in Brazil and West Africa, and then of course now SARS-CoV-2. So the question that we face is not if, but what's next. And so the more we can understand how vaccines and eventually drugs and all that are developed and accelerated, the more I think we will be in better shape to take advantage of them early rather than hold back and say, let's wait and see, because waiting and seeing is basically putting ourselves at risk of getting natural infection. So I'll leave it there. I'll hand the time back to Alberini, and happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ooi on the comprehensive overview on the vaccine development, safety, and its effectiveness. Your lock and key, factory, library analogies made your presentation so easy for me to understand, and I'm sure I speak the same for many of you in the audience today. Now, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, many find it very hard to handle the pandemic mentally and emotionally. Many have to grapple and balance between work and home needs, especially when working from home, adjusting to a new normal where in-person social interactions are limited, and grapple with physical isolation with loved ones. Now, how do we cope with anxiety and isolation? What can we do to support ourselves and those we care through such challenging times? Here to tell us more, we are privileged to have Ms. Evangeline Tan, a Singaporean who is based in Germany. Evangeline is a medical biotechnologist, licensed forensic and clinical psychologist. After completing her training in Canada and the USA, Evangeline worked in the area of forensics internationally before moving to Germany. With psychological work in the forensic and clinical areas spanning more than 15 years, she's currently working as a forensic psychologist under the Ministry of Justice in the state of Hesse, Germany, and also works as a clinical psychologist in the Rhine-Main area. She's a full associate member of the American Psychological Association and a member of the German Society for Psychoanalysis, Psychotherapy, and Psychosomatic and Depth Psychology. I will now hand the time over to Evangeline. Evangeline, please.
Okay. Hello, hi, good afternoon and good evening. Can you see the screen? All right, so. Oh, for some reason, I'm in here. Sorry about that. So, thank you, Renee. Good afternoon and good evening to everyone. Just a quick highlight. Psychoanalysis is an intensive treatment approach which addresses a wide range of human relational problems and emotional health problems. The core of psychoanalysis is the belief that all people possess unconscious thoughts, feelings, desires, and memories. It aims at structural changes and modification of a person's personality through the awareness of unconscious, maladaptive, and habitually recurrent patterns of emotions and behavior. In contrast to a program like reasoning and rehabilitation, such programs are very much based on the more commonly known behavioral therapy, which is often used in short-term institutionalized care like in hospitals or schools or in the forensic areas. It's based on the principles of learning and conditioning to eliminate symptoms and modify ineffective or maladaptive patterns of behavior. So the focus of behavioral therapy is upon the behavior itself and the contingencies and environmental factors that reinforce it, rather than the exploration of the underlying psychological causes of the behavior. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we're living through a world crisis, I think the likes of which hasn't been seen in 100 years. It is particularly stressful because the enormous scale of the crisis and the impact it is having makes it very hard to predict how things will develop. Circumstances change very rapidly from week to week. And many people struggle with this lack of security in knowing what, when, and how. If you add on, like in Europe, if you add on the long, dark, and cold winter months, coupled with prolonged social isolation, disrupted work and family routines, as well as economic instability, it becomes very understandable that mental health is suffering. Even now that there's promising news about the vaccines, many people have the feeling like, if I have any optimism, it'll be shielded by a layer of doubt and pessimism, especially since the security of that certainty is not there. leaving many people feeling very frustrated and helpless. All the family gatherings and celebrations last year that didn't happen, add on to this year's festivities coming up. Many people miss their parents, miss their family, but you also feel that you're kind of tight and locked into the situation. And for some people, this anxiety can develop to a point where recurring intrusive thoughts or concerns become very persistent and intense. So in times like this, what is really important is for us to understand what is important for us and doing what matters. Understanding and being empathetic to the situation, the COVID situation in this case, to parties. When I talk about parties, I mean all the people involved, whether it's the governments, the hospitals, the workers, and us being in this situation. Why? Because empathetic understanding brings us on the way to accept a certain situation. Acceptance in such a difficult time is important because acceptance brings us to start with questions like, what does it require from me as a person, as a daughter, as a son, as a parent, as an employee, or a boss in this situation? So what do I need to roll with the situation? This is the beginning of the idea of solidarity, which can really only come with the beginning of empathetic understanding. So we accept changes in work life and family life. So work environment changes, changes in presence at work, changes in family dynamics, changes in how we have traditionally always been able to do things in a family, changes in family routines, and accepting that certain changes may be here to stay. In the acceptance of losses, if we think about all the way from last year, precious moments with one another, family occasions that have been missed, a 3-year-old child who should have begun his phase or her phase of getting to build up new friendships and didn't get to do it because you're locked in, because the child cares were open and they were closed and then they were open again. So these moments are lost. Even the children who are at home doing homeschooling, the social relationships for these children, this time is lost to us. And accepting what we have lost allows us to begin positive living. That means making positive living possible again, because it sets us emotionally free to focus on the new situation and discover new things and ways to make life enjoyable for us again, despite the losses. Now, when I talk about acceptance, I don't mean you should just sit there and say, okay, that's it, I'm done. Acceptance here means moving ahead with the way your life is now. You move beyond being trapped by the situation. And when you do that, you transfer that energy, your energy, and you set it free. You set free strength to deal with the real situation. Accepting also doesn't mean that the situation is nice or you'll come to like it eventually. It definitely doesn't mean that you have to endorse it anyway. It just means that you actively remove the power from the situation and no longer allow that life situation to be your punching bag and the source of every frustration, every anger, every worry, every resentment you have. Now, when you don't accept, this is where we talk about the other side of acceptance. It means you start and you continue to fight that situation or you put up a resistance against it. So instead of rolling with it, fighting here means you make decisions to try and change a situation for yourself before it's time or before life allows it to happen. So as an analogy, imagine that you have a lovely apple tree in your garden and this tree has wonderful unripe apples on it. And you really wish you could have them right now. Now, just because you stand in front of the tree every day, watching it, begging the tree, watering every day, doesn't mean that the apples are going to come tomorrow or next week. So some things just need time and the element of wait. So not necessarily your time. Now, when you accept this situation, you change the focus of your energies. What actually you start to do is you ask yourself the question, what else can I do in this garden to make it better for myself while I'm waiting for my apples to ripe? Once we start this process of acceptance, we start to move into the process of adaptation. When we are in the process of accepting a situation, we adapt to the new situation. We find and develop new ways to live the way we want to live in this new situation. We open ourselves to new experiences. pick up new skills, learn new things. We widen our limits and the perspective of how life is and will become for us. When this happens, life becomes slowly but increasingly enjoyable as we learn to focus, to discover and gain new ways to ease our lives, for example, into what we would now call the COVID world. For example, celebrations and gatherings. Try gathering online. Look at the gains. Look at what you gain. You don't need to travel or fly or drive. And because you don't, it means you can gather and meet more often. If you've always met up with your family or friends once or twice a year, now you can have a meal, if you want, once a week together. You can sit together for a meal thousands of kilometers across the globe, once a week if your schedules allow it. And you'll see that once you start to do this, your life thousands of kilometers away from your family becomes extremely intensively shared. Suddenly how they live and how you live become very real because you meet so regularly and because they see you in it and you see them in theirs. So when we focus our energies on what is available for us right now, you start to become creative and you start to discover. So if you're not allowed to go to a restaurant or fly home to eat your favorite meals, you can learn to make it within your four walls. Take the time to learn something new. If you live in a country where the language isn't your first, you might now have the time to learn and improve on it. If you're stuck at home with the children, discover and develop new ways to be with your kids. Before COVID-19, this is very interesting because before COVID-19, many people dreamed of working from home because it's so nice. Now you have it. Now you can work all the way from home if you like. Many people dream of spending more time at home and spending more time with their children. My goodness, now you can have your kids 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day. You know, so you might be saying, yeah, well, I need a break from this, or I don't have the time for all this. Remember, in adaptation, it also means that we all need to restructure our day and establish new routines for yourself. And if you have kids, helping your kids to do that. So home office, homeschooling, even the people delivering the lessons, the teachers, the schools, all of this, balance with the housework, the kids, and your work, all of this take time. And all of this can be challenging to get used to. And everybody needs the time to get used to doing this. Because acceptance, adaptation are processes, right? So when we think about taking time or needing time, please be kind to yourself. Be kind to the people around you and your loved ones in the same house. Accepting and adapting take time and energy for everyone. Being kind to yourself also means to remember to take time out and take a break, which means to restructure that into your new structure of your day. So for example, if you know what works for you to de-stress, you used to go to the gym, go swimming, running, walking, do it. Change the circumstances of the run or the gym because it's closed. The swimming pool is closed. If it's not closed, then it has fixed hours now, right? So change the circumstances of what used to work for you so that you can possibly build into your schedule, in your structure, and if need be, include the children or anyone else in the family you have to include. It may not be exactly the same training and performance or the same speed run you've always been running or pumping, but what you're doing is you're adapting what used to work for you right now. And if you have children, for the kids and for your family. In establishing new structure, we also need to talk about setting new boundaries. Right? At one time, we went to work. Now, if you're doing home office, work is coming into your home. Consider how work is going to affect or has already affected your private life, or may even threaten your role as a parent. Right? Establish that structure, work on communication at home with your family, and develop that cooperation into your new structure. Developing and setting new healthy boundaries for everyone and learning to function again as a family in this new structure is important. Now, again, when we set boundaries in this adaptation process, we also need to accept that everyone, the kids, the husband, the wife, the grandparents, everybody in that house face a new situation. And all parties need time to accept and adapt to that situation. It's not going to go as quickly as, So if you come up with a sheet of paper as mom or dad and say, okay, tomorrow we're going to start doing this, that is rarely going to work. I mean, you'll be just fighting a huge frustration there. Communicate, get everyone to cooperate. Even the new phase of parenting, where kids and spouses are at home most of the time, or all of the time, where parenting is not outsourced, takes time in acceptance and adapting to it. And the thinking is, well, you'll have to adapt to it because you're in each other's faces all the time. Keep in mind, though, that when we do not work towards accepting the situation, which is sometimes not easy, that's why in my earlier slide, I talked about crossing the sea of acceptance, right? But accepting is important here because if you fight it persistently, you'll just end up tired, more frustrated, and more anxious because you're not seeing your desired outcome. You put so much into it, but there's no desired outcome. And what your kids are seeing every day is that so long as we are home, we see an angry mommy and an angry daddy all day. They're angry because we're at home all day, right? That's very important, especially if you're a parent, to realize that that's what your kids see when you are upset with them all day. So when we think about all of this and all of our gains, there's still many of the things that we have that we love that still exist around us. In fact, we might have already gained a lot of things we never thought were possible, have become possible. Webinars, reduced travel time, opening new possibilities for work and travel and meeting. 2 years ago or a year ago, nobody would have thought of organizing a Zoom birthday for a child. But today it's there. Challenging times remind us of how precious all our good memories and our strong, stable social connections are. So remember to keep on connecting with people who care for you, whom you care for, and to be open to reach out for support should you ever need it. So if you feel that your anxiety symptoms are becoming more intrusive, more intense, or if you experience intense episodes of anxiety, fear, or even terror, please contact your doctor or your therapist. I have here a couple of numbers. Now, if you look over here, this number should work for most countries in Europe. I tested a few of them. They're actually available through telephone if you're near to a location. App, there's also a confidential email system, for example, if you need help in a different language. International helplines, if you go on this website and you scroll down, you'll actually find that country. Just be aware that there might be costs incurred if you have a preferred language where they have to look for someone else. Down there, over here, I have the Singapore hotlines that you can call. On this website, you'll find helplines differentiated depending on what their need is. So please have a look and don't shy from using them. On this note, thank you very much, and I'll pass the time back to Albertini. Thank you.
Thank you, Evangeline. I mean, there's so many takeaways from your sharing. I mean, a few takeaways that I have is that we have to acknowledge the realities right now, and I think it's important to be kind to ourselves and to be kind to others as well. So let's hang on there together and then write this difficult time out together and with our loved ones. So we will now move on to our Q&A. Now, thank you to many of you who have submitted questions at the point of registration, many of which Professor Ooi and Evangeline have addressed some of them during their sharing. I'll now look over to the Q&A section that we have and some of the questions that have been raised and also upvoted. Well, I'll choose the questions that will be relevant for Prof. Ooi and or Evangeline to address. Now, I think one of the top voted questions that came in is by Annie. Hi, thanks for tuning in. And her questions are, firstly, what happens if a person received injections from 2 different vaccines? And, for example, the first one could be from Pfizer and the second one could be from Moderna. And then secondly is, what happens if the second dose was delayed and, a person gets her second injection like many months later? Does it affect the efficacy? Maybe this question for Professor Ooi, please.
Sure, thanks for the question, Annie. So I don't think there's going to be any problem if you receive 2 different vaccines. I half suspect that it will actually be beneficial, depending on the sequence of vaccination, of course, which one was first and which one was second. The only thing that we don't know from this combination of vaccine is we don't know eventually what is the efficacy, right? So we know for Pfizer, BioNTech, the efficacy is 95%, Moderna is 94%. What if you mix and match? Will it be 95? Will it be 94? We don't know. What if the first one is, say, BioNTech, then you follow up with J&J, which is about 60%. Then, what happens next? The problem is that we don't know what the final efficacy is. I think there will be efficacy, but I just no one will know exactly what that is, right? So that makes it a little bit harder for ministries of health and all that to monitor how well the preventive program is going. So ideally, we try not to have to do it, but I understand that in places like the UK and all that, because of the urgency as well as the shortage of vaccine, that's what is being done. So scientifically, I don't see a problem. So what happens if you delay it, just like what the UK is suggesting? Again, I don't think there's going to be a problem, except that we don't know the efficacy in between the two doses. So the reason why the vaccines are given 1 month apart is simply because that's how they've done the trial, right? So what if it's 6 weeks? What about if it's 2 months? What if it's 3 months? The problem there is that we don't know what happens in between the two doses. So ideally, we want to administer the vaccine the way the trial was conducted, so that we know the outcome, or we can expect the outcome. When we start to chop and change, then it makes it, we introduce unknown elements into the vaccination program.
Thank you. And let's now turn over to another question more for Evangeline. We've got Carolina tuning in today. Hi, thanks for joining us. She's asking, or rather she said that focusing on the gains is a good strategy to practice. Any resources that would you recommend to help us deal with the lows? And the local community in Germany has helped a lot, but navigating the journey seeking professional support, especially in a foreign language, can be daunting for some. Any comments to that, Evangeline?
So let me try. So if I understand that right, the question is about resources where we can receive gains, and also if there's any professional avenues where we can turn to. Is that? Yeah. So when we think about gains, it does require a certain level of, in the adaptation process, a certain level of creativity. The reason why I talked about acceptance is because accepting the situation is important if we want to rechannel the time that we think about what is happening with us, the frustrating time, into something new. So it does require some kind of creativity in thinking about, for example, if you used to go for a run alone and that helped, what are you going to do now? Do you want to take your kids for the run? Do you want to adjust the type of run? So that actually does require families to sit down and say, well, if I need this for myself for a break, I can't do this right now because I've got to take care of the kids, or my husband has to take care of the kids. What can we do together as a couple to make sure that we both get that break sometime in between? So the family actually has to sit together and discuss how we can build that into the new structure. In terms of professional help, I put in some lines, and those are actually at the last slide. Those are actually some of the, you want to talk to someone online, you can do that. Now, if you think that it would be more helpful to talk to somebody who's professional, in Germany, the way would have, you can actually just write. If you see someone, if you Google a therapist, or you can ask somebody, I wouldn't mind if anybody has a specific concern that they have, to channel that particular private medical question over, and then we can see if somebody is suitable for you. But you do have to then go through the normal healthcare system then, if that's who you want to see. Depending on the intensity of the problem, how anxious or how worried someone is, that can also differ the type of person that you see. I hope that answered the question.
Great. And I'm going to take a question that actually came in at the point of registration, which I think would be quite applicable to many of us in the audience, would be that, particularly in the face of working from home, right? Balancing between work needs and home needs. And, when your kids are with you, you do typically have a routine, right? School runs, so on and so forth. But now that you have to work from home, how does one kind of set boundaries between work and family and commitments and the priorities when working from home? Any thoughts on that, Evangeline?
Well, there are a few parties involved, right? So when we set boundaries, we don't just say I set boundaries for my children, for my husband, for my wife, for my work. The boundaries apply also to work, which means that if you have an employer who is very understanding, great for you. If you don't, then you need to set that boundary there that they understand. And sometimes that worry is, yeah, but you know what, if I tell them this and then I don't want to lose my job. The thing is that you have a situation at home that you have to deal with, and it's been over a year, which means that actually, my experience is most employers know what they have to deal with. It is very normal nowadays to go into a webinar session, a conference session online, and sometimes have kids dancing behind you. Very few people take that as a bad signal now. In the past, it used to be, oh, how unprofessional. But nowadays, we're seeing politicians, we're seeing scientists go online and having that same situation. And I think when we talk about boundaries, it's important to think that it's not just boundaries in your private life, but you need to set your professional life where you say, I'm sorry, but I need, if you're a mother and you need to breastfeed right now, that's okay to just say that, I'm sorry, but I have to do this right now. I could listen in, but, and that to also make the employer clear, because I'm pretty sure 1.5, well, not a half yet, but over a year into this, governments are encouraging people to work from home. So that is something that all employers know.
Got it. Thank you. And maybe this question for Professor Ooi now from Samuel Chong. His question is, given the mutation of the virus, does the vaccine need to be constantly updated to tackle these mutations? And if so, will there be a need for new vaccination for the South African variant? I think I'm going to also ask kind of a follow-up question as well. I mean, you know, you're talking about vaccine. Do you foresee like the COVID-19 vaccine to be something as regularly to be taken like an influenza jab every year? Because for the influenza jab, right, you do take it every year because again, there is a mutant to the flu virus, right? So what are your thoughts on this?
No, great question. So let me take the second one first, and I'll come back to the first. So the question of whether we need a repeated vaccination is something we don't know at the moment, right? So I think someone also asked about what are the clinical trials, phase 1, 2, 3. Very briefly, phase 1 is to test how safe the vaccine is in humans, and usually we test a range of doses to find how high can we go before we start to get all these side effects that people don't like. Then 2, once you do that, then you know what dose you're dealing with. Then you go into phase 2, which is now in the region of about slightly less than 1,000 people. The first one is usually about 100. So then you go into about 1,000 people, and there you test to see whether at that dose that you have chosen from phase 1, whether it continues to be safe and also produces the right immune response. Phase 3 is the pivotal trial. It's the one that tests whether the vaccine can prevent against disease. So that's what all the licensed vaccines have completed. So because of the sheer number of COVID-19 cases, usually phase 3 trial, which takes about a year, if not longer, now is done within months because there's so many cases, right? And it's a numbers game. As long as you have enough numbers, you can determine whether the vaccine works or not. So Pfizer's trial was done observed over a 2-month period from the second dose. Moderna also about 2-3 months. Likewise, all the other trials. So therefore, although we know that the vaccine works, we don't know how long it lasts. So that question that you asked, do we need repeated vaccination, is something that we can only know as as ministries of health monitor the vaccinated population. My suspicion is that it won't be an annual vaccination. We may need repeated jabs several years later, but it's not going to be like flu. And the reason why it's not going to be like flu is the answer to the first question: what happens with the mutants, right? Because the reason why we need repeated or seasonal or annual flu vaccination is because of the mutation the virus is undergoing, so that there are some changes, and therefore that our immunity from last year's vaccination isn't going to protect us against this year's flu virus. And that's where I think I kind of skipped over that. I showed you the different forms of vaccine. So the flu vaccine is like your Sinovac vaccine, is like your Sinopharm, like your Bharat Biotech. So it's a killed virus. And so that kind of vaccine only produces antibody. In other words, you are only trying to stop the key from getting into the lock and turning the lock. If the antibody levels are not high enough, or there's mutation changes to the key, you alter the key a little bit, and now you lose some of the antibodies, and therefore you cannot completely stop the key from getting into the lock, then you have a problem because now the virus is going to get in. And that's why I personally favor those vaccines that will also give you the killer cells, because even if the virus escapes and goes inside, the killer cells will still get rid of it. The killer cells, the way they recognize the virus is different from antibody. It's not just stopping the key alone, it's stopping everything about the virus, right? So it's not recognizing the key, but it's now zooming in into specific component, right? Is it a Yale key? Is it a, whatever, another brand or something like that? So it's recognized bits and pieces. It's not seeing the whole thing. And because it's recognized bits and pieces across the entire chain, you need to literally change almost the entire virus to be able to escape the killer T cells. It makes it very hard for the virus to mutate to such an extent that your killer cells won't be able to recognize it. Literally, it will almost be like a different virus. So therefore, I think that the RNA vaccines and all that, I think their potency against the variants, South African, the British, and all that, will be less affected than the killed vaccines.
Thank you. Okay, so I've got a question for Evangeline. I think right now with working from home, and I think with the lockdown situation in many countries, families are kind of in isolation with their loved ones, hankering down during this, this current situation. There's a question from Adeline asking, do you have any tips on how to help my teenage daughter deal with the isolation? She's on social media, chats with her friends, and joins a few online activities, but she's not her usual lively self. I'm going to take this, with a follow-up question as well, is that, with families right now hankering down together, then, in that space and in that house, for example, how does the family, for example, or how does one cope with, claustrophobia while in quarantine or in isolation?
I'm just going to start with the first part of the question. I think it's quite normal, as we see right now, that we've had a lot of, in the past few months, we've had a lot of parents who say that I've noticed that my child, regardless of how old they are, has shown some behavioral changes. I wouldn't say it's not normal, because, well, they're away from that structure. They used to have a structure that ran for years. And if she's a teenager, she's had years, a certain structure that meant going to school, having friends. Now, all that is cut off, so which means that they are now very focused on the media, their cell phones, whatever else is available to them, right? So encountering your child as different or not as lively before is probably not that abnormal, unless there are certain pinpoints where you say that's really not normal. I would also say that the very fact that your daughter has actually been able to do all those things, like, okay, well, I can't see my best friend, so we're chatting, it's not really the same, but shows how much resources this girl has. Well, she could just sit in a corner and say, I'm just going to wake up every day at 2 o'clock and just do whatever there is. She's actually trying whatever is available to her, maybe with support from her mom, from your parents, or from the parents or not. But the child itself is already adapting to that situation. If these are the described things that she's doing for herself, she's adapting, probably adapting better than parents. Usually it's like that. And so I wouldn't be that worried unless you really see, like something's really weird here. She's sitting in a corner and crying every day, right? Of course, when you can support her is also sitting down and talking to her and asking how she's feeling, how the situation is going to be, which means you need to sit down and talk to your kids and say, how is everything? Maybe check out how social media is working for her, and if she has any concerns and worries. That would be the one key point in understanding how your teenager is really dealing with the situation right now. And in terms of claustrophobia, and in terms of how it would work if you're in isolation and if you're thinking of quarantine or if you're in quarantine, would depend on two factors. Number one, the quality of your quarantine. If you're going to go into quarantine or you're thinking about going to quarantine, it would depend on what kind of a quarantine that is. How much freedom do you have? Do you have control over the situation? How much control do you not have? Because claustrophobia has a lot to do with fear of losing control in many situations. So the quality or the type of quarantine you're in is very important. And then the state of the patient at the point of entering quarantine. So these two things we would have to know these two things before you can actually look into the crystal ball and see how you would actually function. So if somebody No, if you know that you actually have claustrophobia and you're actually thinking of doing that, I would always advise to please talk to your doctor first, because they would have firsthand knowledge of how you've been functioning the last few months. If you're already in it, well, you have to accept that you're in quarantine right now because you can't really leave anymore. So if you're in quarantine right now, look around you and think about what you have. So the very little space that you have, you've got to make the best of it. So if you've got your laptop with you, if you've got a television with you, if you have Netflix with you, good for you. If you don't, it's time to think about maybe, if you're alone in the situation, what you can do. If you have children, then you have to extrapolate what you can do with the kids in that small space. That on that note, if you realize that, or if you have the feeling that your symptoms are getting worse, some people develop panic attacks. Please call the doctor before you develop a panic attack. Right? That's very important to know that. And if you're actually, again, if you're actually thinking, if you are diagnosed claustrophobic and you're actually thinking of going into a very restrictive quarantine procedure, one thing to take away is that we just talked about how much stress some people are having, whether they're alone in their houses now, and how much stress parents are having with their children in their own homes. Now, if you go into a restrictive quarantine situation where the space is not controlled by you and your structure is not controlled by you, that stress is going to highly possibly extrapolate, right? So just keep that in mind, that if you really want to do that, talk to your doctor first.
Great, thank you for that. And yes, please always seek help, and more importantly, speak to your family members. If you do feel any, not feeling good that emotionally, I think it's very important to just speak to someone. And it is always okay not to feel okay. So maybe looking at the time, maybe I'll just have one last question, and if I may actually direct that to Professor Ooi. Ooi, or rather, there's a question asking about, with all these tests running, right, and so much research on the COVID-19 virus. Now, is there actually any evidence at all that the body can actually form your own antibodies and create our own immune system to these viruses?
Yeah, the answer is yes. So upon infection, your body will also generate antibodies and T cells. But it comes at a price. The price is that you then have to suffer COVID-19. And there is no way of predicting, of course, before you get the infection, whether you're going to get severe COVID-19 or not. Now, obviously, there are factors like age, whether you have high blood pressure, heart disease, and diabetes, and all that, also chronic diseases in the background, then obviously those are at risk. But we also know that even young, healthy adults can also get very severe disease. So then that makes it less predictable. So therefore, the vaccine is a safer way of getting immunity than to rely on natural infection. The other issue of natural infection, of course, is that, again, who's going to get long COVID and how long, and the severity of that long COVID is again not something that we can predict and say, well, for person A, you can go ahead and take the chance of becoming naturally infected and then develop natural immunity, whereas person B is better off getting the vaccine. So I think all in all, the vaccine is just a much safer way and more controlled way of getting immunity than to rely on a natural infection. I think there are also some questions say, what if we already have COVID, should I get vaccinated? There's no harm. In fact, the current studies are showing that if for a 2-dose vaccine, if you have had COVID before, then only 1 dose is needed and you will get a very good immune response. So I think all in all, vaccination is a much safer strategy to gaining immunity than to rely on natural infection. I think Alberini is frozen.
Yes, technical issues always with Zoom. Well, thank you so much, Evangeline and Dr. Ooi, for your sharing and also your answers to many of the questions. I'm afraid that's that much time that we have in answering the questions, and I hope we've answered as many as we can today. Now, before I end today's event, I would actually now like to pass the time over to Ambassador Bay for his concluding remarks. Ambassador, please.
Thanks, Alberini. And my personal thanks to Professor Ooi and Evangeline for all your valuable insights and your willingness to tackle so many questions from our Singaporeans here in Europe. Before we close the webinar, as promised, let me just address some of the questions on how can overseas Singaporeans get their vaccinations back home in Singapore. And I have grouped the questions that we have received into two broad categories, right? The first category of questions are mainly related to eligibility. And the second group has to do with the process itself. Now, obviously, we're not going to spend another 1 hour talking about this. And I'm also very mindful that there are many Singaporeans out there who have very specific circumstances, very unique circumstances. So some of my responses may not address these specific concerns. I'm trying to tailor my remarks more for the vast majority of Singaporeans. So first on eligibility, and here I'm assuming that you agree to be vaccinated because as we all know, vaccination is voluntary, right? Now, the basic point you should be aware is that vaccination for Singaporean citizens and permanent residents are only offered in Singapore. Right? Simply put, you can only receive your shots back home, not at our Singapore embassies, consulates, etc. in Europe or anywhere around the world. You have to return physically to Singapore to receive your 2 doses. And as Prime Minister Lee had announced several weeks ago, COVID-19 vaccinations is free for all Singapore citizens, PRs, and long-term pass holders. Second, MOH or Ministry of Health will progressively announce which population groups will be eligible to receive the vaccination. Right now, the first group consists of health or medical workers, frontline personnel, and those deemed to be the most vulnerable age group, that is senior citizens who are 70 years old and above. Which means for the majority of us Singaporeans, whether living in Singapore or overseas, it is not our turn to be vaccinated, not yet, right? After the priority population group gets vaccinated and depending on vaccine supply situation and other factors, MOH will announce which population group, their turn to be vaccinated. So I would advise you to look out regularly for the public announcements. Best way I would recommend is check the MOH website, www.vaccine.gov.sg. Very easy to remember, and you will find plenty of information over there. Which brings me to my third point on eligibility. As we have already heard from Prof. Ooi, if you have certain pre-existing medical conditions, it may not be advisable for you to be vaccinated. So please check the MOH website for the health advisory, right? A lot of information there. Now, let me address questions related to how to get your vaccination done in Singapore. That is the process. First, let me assure you the process is not complicated. Okay, it's not complicated. If you are eligible, basically you will need to first register your interest to be vaccinated, right? Register your interest to be vaccinated. Second, book an online appointment. Book an online appointment. And then third, obviously, go and receive your doses, your 2 shots. Now, details like date, location of vaccination center, can I change appointment, what happens if I'm not well 24 hours before the vaccination, after the vaccination, all this information can be found on the MOH website. It is very comprehensive, very simple. But even if you have no time to look through all the details, you cannot remember all the details, don't worry. You will be guided through the process step by step. Now, the question we are all probably asking is, how do I know if it is my turn to be vaccinated, right? When is it my turn? How do I know? So here, let me speak directly first to those who are 70 years old, Singaporeans who are 70 years and above, because you are the first group, right? You are the first group that's eligible for the vaccination. It is your turn if you decide you would like to be vaccinated. Now, you will soon receive a letter at your registered address in Singapore. All right, this will come probably in the next few days, this month, February. So if I may suggest, please ask your next of kin, your NOK, or your relative in Singapore to look out for the letter and then to inform you. If you don't have a registered address in Singapore, don't worry. There are also many other options. First option, MOH website. right? After MOH announced that registration is open to all seniors in Singapore, please visit the website www.vaccine.gov.sg. Don't go to any other website. There are some websites out there, right, trying to be funny and all that. Please go to the official MOH website, www.vaccine.gov.sg. And then you just follow the steps. Very simple. So for our Singaporean seniors, uncle and aunties, please check the website or look out for the MOH letter. Ask your relative or NOK to help you. Now, there are other options too. If for some reason, for example, you don't get the letter, right? No one in Singapore to help you. Not sure about this, not sure about that. Not to worry as well. You can email or contact our Singapore embassies in Europe. But better still, please contact the MOH directly and they will attend to you. Now, if you for those seniors who happen to be in Singapore during this period, you can also approach the community centers or call the MOH hotline, right? They will guide you through this process. But please remember, Singaporeans, this is only for those who are 70 years and above, seniors, right? Because it is their turn when registration is open. So that's for our seniors, the first batch or age group in Singapore to be vaccinated. What about the rest of us, right? What about the rest of the Singaporean population? Now, process-wise, it will be largely similar. MOH will make the public announcements on the population groups to be vaccinated in the coming weeks or months. And if you are in that particular population group, you will need to register your interest, you need to make an online appointment, and then you receive your shots. Now, some groups may come before others. So may I just encourage all of us to wait for our turn, as Evangeline said, right? To be patient, let the system function the way it is supposed to function, right? And you should receive your vaccination this year. I'm sure some of you are wondering, should I register and make an appointment before booking my air tickets or return to Singapore first? What happens if I have family members of different age groups? How many days of leave do I need to take, etc., etc.? Again, obviously, everyone's circumstances and situation are different, but for sure, for the large majority of us, some advanced and careful planning will be required before you travel back to Singapore for your vaccination. But what you need to know is this: whether you are 70 years older or younger, everyone who returns to Singapore needs to serve 14 days quarantine at a designated facility. And you can only get your vaccination after that vaccination period, not during, okay? After the vaccination period, which, as all of you know, with effect from January 1st this year, the 14-day quarantine is no longer complimentary. And as we have heard, the two doses are administered about 21 to 28 days apart. So that means you have to be prepared to spend 14 days of quarantine plus an additional month in Singapore, total about 1.5 months, right, to be completely vaccinated. Now, in between, you may leave the country after taking the first dose, right, and before your second shot. But please note, you have to serve the 14 days quarantine every time you re-enter Singapore. So please factor all this in the planning of your travel itinerary. Question about the vaccine types in Singapore. We have, as you know, we have approved the use of Pfizer and Moderna. So some questions like, can choose or not? You know, can I request one type of vaccine over the other? Unfortunately, not. Right? Our health authorities will carefully evaluate which are the vaccines that will be most appropriate for the different population subgroups in Singapore. There's another question. What happens after I've been vaccinated? You know, does it mean I can travel to Singapore anytime and not serve quarantine? No need to do SHN anymore in the future? Again, unfortunately not. Okay, you can't do that. As I said earlier, all travelers, including those who have been vaccinated, will continue to be subject to prevailing border measures and SHN requirements. Right? Of course, MOH will continuously review this and adjust based on the scientific findings. Right, I plan to stop here because if I go on, I think there will be too many details, and I believe we already have a lot of information to process this afternoon. So please visit the MOH website, www.vaccine.gov.sg, because you will get the most up-to-date and complete set of information over there. And if for some reason the MOH website still doesn't address your query satisfactorily, you are most welcome to email MOH directly, and they will, I'm sure, do their best to address them. It leaves me now to just reiterate my deepest thanks on behalf of all my MFA and SGN colleagues to Professor Wee and Evangeline. A personal word of thanks to my SGN colleagues for partnering the embassy in organizing today's webinar. And last but certainly not least, to you, our viewers, we have more than 140 of you online. To you, our fellow Singaporeans, thank you very much for joining us this past hour. I really hope it has been has been useful and enlightening to you. So I wish you and everyone in your household continue good health. Please adhere to the social distancing guidelines in your local areas. Please stay safe and please stay warm. Thank you and see you again.